There does seem to be a disjunction between the words crusading and medics. Not in terms of the way in which many doctors crusade for the causes they believe in, but of the disjunction between the fighting nature of the crusaders and of the life-saving work of doctors. There was no such distinction in the minds of the Knights Hospitaller, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, a body of crusading knights dedicated to looking after the sick. In the late 11th century, there was a need to develop to defend pilgrims to the Holy Land. And this inspired the formation of a military religious order dedicated not only to the protection of pilgrims, but also to the care of the sick. In about 1100, Gerard Tum founded the Knights Hospitaller as the guardians of the Benedictine Hospital in Jerusalem, which had been founded in 1023. Now, medieval hospitals were not hospitals as we think of them, but they were more hostels for pilgrims. But many of these needed medical care, and so it was provided in these hostels or hospices or hospitals. Well, the new order was given papal recognition by Pope Paschal II in 1113, and it adopted as its motto, Pro Fide, Pro Utilitate Hominum, for the faith and in the service of humanity. Watchwords which remain with it throughout its existence. Recognition came from the Holy Roman Empire when the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa gave the order a chart of privileges in 1185. Over time, its military role expanded. The statutes of Roger de Moulin of 1187 talk of service to the sick. By 1200, the statutes of the 9th Grand Master, Alfonso of Portugal, had divided the order into several groups: secular knights, professed knights, who were attached to the order by a perpetual vow. In effect, there were three classes of membership: the military brothers, the brothers infirmarians, and the brothers chaplains. A military dress of a red surcoat with a white cross emblazoned was approved by Pope Innocent IV in 1248. Very much this was a band of aristocratic warriors who were living according to a semi-monastic discipline. The order soon became popular. It acquired extensive property in the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Antioch from the rulers, and also from other lay supporters. In the 13th century, it had 7 forts, 140 estates. Under it, there were priories, bailiwicks, and commanderies. It was a complex institution. Well, perhaps two of its most famous castles were Crac de Chevalier and Margat, both of them under threat by the political situation in the Middle East today. Just as they were originally built to deal with a very difficult political situation then, they are now World Heritage Sites, but sadly are at risk. The main hospital of the order remained in Jerusalem. It occupied a site of 37 acres near to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It had 2,000 beds and was in operation from 1023 to 1457 when it was damaged by an earthquake. Later, a vegetable market was set up on the site, and then it was excavated between 2000 and 2013. Parts of the remains were planned to become a very expensive restaurant. Even after the fall of Jerusalem to the Saracens, Saladin allowed the hospital to continue to provide medical care in Jerusalem. Now, much of the medicine practiced there was based on the Arab medicine, which was very influential in the transmission of medical knowledge from the ancient world to medieval and Renaissance Western Europe. The ideas of Avicenna were adopted. Well, soon the vast estates in the Holy Land were to be lost. In 1291, Acre fell, the last bastion. The Order of St. John of Jerusalem, the Knights Hospitaller, fought bravely, but had to go into exile. First of all in Cyprus. Then they were able to acquire Rhodes as their base from 1309, and they were to stay there till they were expelled in 1522. Rhodes today is a beautiful spot. The old town is dominated by the remains of the buildings erected by the Knights Hospitaller. The hospital there was built from 1440 to 1489 and is a wonderful, very impressive piece of architecture, very evocative building. It housed 100 patients in 32 communal halls, each dominated by an altar in the centre of the ward that would be visible to all. Religion, as much as medical care, was central to the care of the patient. There was even a contagious diseases ward in a separate hall. The hospital, with the oriel above its gatehouse, was very close to the conventual church of St. John the Baptist, and from there, along the side of the hospital, the Street of the Knights led up to the Palace of the Grand Master. The palace we see today was built during the Italian occupation at the beginning of the 20th century, and perhaps reflects more the fascist government of the time's view of the Knights' occupation of Rhodes. They saw it very much as Italianate. But along the street of the knights were the auberges of the different groups of knights. These were organised in langue based on the languages spoken. In 1301, the langues included those of Provence, the Auvergne, France, Castile and Leon, Portugal, Aragon, Navarre, Italy, England and Germany. Each langue was responsible for the repair, building and defence of a section of the still impressive walls that surround Rhodes. In addition to the knights, which were communal places of resort for them, the knights would have their own lodgings in the town of Rhodes. This was walled off from the local population. Both in Rhodes and later in Malta, the knights remained separate from the local population, completely walled off. They continue to hold estates throughout Western Europe. In England, their headquarters was in Clerkenwell, London. The gatehouse of that great priory can still be seen at St. John's Gate. It now houses the Museum of the Order of St. John. The crypt of their once magnificent church still remains and can be visited. Then, after the suppression of the Knights Templar in 1312, the Hospitallers acquired their estates, including the temple. It's interesting that the inner temple on its crest bears the Lamb of St. John. This reflects the fact that the legal profession soon used the disused parts of the former Knights Templar estates, but had their links with the Knights Hospitaller. Well, as the years and centuries went by, the Eastern Mediterranean came under threat from the Ottomans. The Knights was to successfully defend themselves in the Siege of Rhodes in 1480, only to be expelled after the second siege in 1522 by Suleiman the Magnificent. The Knights were expelled. Casualties were carried into exile on board the kayak Santa Maria, which was converted to a hospital ship. Now, generally, throughout their existence, the Knights did not have dedicated hospital ships, but they would adapt ships for such purposes when necessary. In fact, the high standard of care was attested in 1617 on board some of their ships by Count Georg of Erbach, who described his own experience as a patient of the Knights on board a ship. They made me a bed among the Knights, one of whom was always carefully tending me, and after meals, two of them would come to make my bed afresh, covering it with red damask. The bed linen was again changed the following morning. Now, by the 16th century, the Knights of St. John were very much naval warriors, rather than the land-based knights they had been in the Holy Land. In 1522, they first found refuge in Sicily. And then in 1530 they were granted Malta by the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V in return for an annual tribute of a Maltese falcon, which would be paid to the governor of Sicily. Malta had previously been governed and ruled by Sicily, one of only a series of foreign rulers that was to continue with the Knights and later under French occupation and British rule. Now, this Maltese falcon wasn't the magnificent golden statue of Dashiell Hammett's novel. It was an actual falcon. Now, by this time, Malta enjoyed a strategic importance for the control of the Mediterranean and its trade routes. It was at the meeting point of the Eastern and Western Mediterraneans. It had a great defensive role. The Ottoman Turks pursued the Knights from Rhodes and in 1565 besieged Malta, the Great Siege of Malta. It was touch and go as to whether the Knights would prevail, especially after the loss to the Turks of the castle of St. Elmo. Many Knights lost their lives. But deliverance came on the 8th of September 1565, when the Turks withdrew following the death of Admiral Dragut. They had failed to maintain communication lines and supplies. By digging in, the Knights were able to survive and were to rebuild Malta after the devastation wreaked during the Great Siege. They now took on a new role of defending the Mediterranean, at first against the Turks, and then, when these were no longer such a threat, after the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, they took on a new defensive role against Barbary pirates. Though some of the Knights were not above piracy themselves. A new capital, Valletta, named after the Grand Master at the time of the siege, Jean Parisot de Valette, was built. It still dominates the Great Harbour. And it is a great experience to sail into the Great Harbour. It's an experience like nothing else. I've been lucky to enjoy it. Well, within the town, a new, very imposing, very impressive hospital was built in 1574, the Sacra Infermeria. It had 6 halls and over 700 beds. Indeed, the Grand Hall was the largest room in Europe. And there was even a hospital for slaves in the basements. Patients in the main wards, though not the slaves, would dine off silver plate, which was considered sterile. At the heart of the new capital of Valletta was the co-cathedral of St. John the Baptist. Among its greatest treasures is Caravaggio's beheading of John the Baptist. A very disturbing and very impressive painting. Caravaggio had fled to Malta after killing a man in a brawl in 1606. He sought the patronage of Alois de Vignacourt, the Grand Master. He painted portraits of many of the knights, as well as the work of art commemorating John the Baptist's execution, which was to be the centrepiece of the cathedral. Caravaggio was even admitted to the order, but in 1608, after another fight with a fellow knight, he was expelled, denied the desired patronage of the Grand Master. He was to have his revenge. Alois de Vignacourt is depicted, or appears to be depicted, in the features of a brutal-looking gravedigger in Caravaggio's painting of the burial of St. Lucy, which is now in Syracuse, Sicily. Only Caravaggio could have his revenge in such a way. Another very impressive, very evocative work of art. This all takes us a long way from the very pious and religious origins of the knights. And by the 18th century, their role was becoming less important. They were leading very secular lives. They built their own grand palaces in Valletta. A villa built by one of them, Giovanni de Bicci, on a cliff top overlooking the Grand Harbour opposite Valletta, was on such an impressive site that it was chosen by Napoleon as a Mediterranean palace site. That palace was never built. And later, the Hospital of Biggie, the greatest British military hospital in the Mediterranean, was built on a site earmarked for Napoleon's Grand Palace, in which incorporated that 17th century villa. They acquired great wealth. They lived wealthy, noble lifestyles, and they were very much remote from the people of Malta. So there were no great tears when in 1799, the last Grand Master, Ferdinand de Hompesch-Zuboheim, surrendered to Napoleon. The knights left Malta. Later, an attempt was made to establish a Russian Orthodox Grand Priory under the Tsar Paul I. Bear in mind that this would be an Orthodox rather than a Roman Catholic order. Despite appearances, there was very little continuity. In 1834, the papacy re-established the Sovereign Military Order of Malta, which is seen and recognised as the true successors to the Knights Hospitaller, to the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Protestant orders were set up in Brandenburg, the Netherlands and Sweden. In 1831, in Britain, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem was set up under the patronage of the British royal family and was given a royal charter. The St. John's Ambulance Brigade is an offshoot of this. So very much the principles of the Knights Hospitaller remain alive even to this day. I hope myself to be able to visit the hospital site in Jerusalem and to see the sites in Acre where they fought to secure, vainly, their last stronghold in the Holy Land. I have seen their sites and their great achievements in Rhodes and in Malta. What is left of their Grand Priory in Clerkenwell is well worth a visit. And it's interesting to note that Cardinal Wolsey's great Hampton Court Palace, later associated with Henry VIII, and also William III and Queen Mary through the work of Sir Christopher Wren, that Hampton Court had its origins in a grange owned by the Knights Hospitaller. We can see their traces around us everywhere. The British Order of St. John even has an eye hospital today in Jerusalem. And if you like, the medical work is continued by the St. John's Ambulance Brigade. So they are all around us, their sights, their memory. So it is well worth visiting some of those. And in doing so, thinking of the history of that military order of Crusading Medics.